Thanks for having me on. I'm stoked because there's so much going on in the podcasting space this week, seemingly.
Yeah, like literally in the last 24 hours. Like I saw a press release last night about Apple Podcasts, and I pulled up my phone to start reading the article about Apple Podcasts is basically doing their own Patreon premium content subscription stuff now. And then like almost immediately after that, I got someone sent me an article about Facebook releasing audio rooms and messenger chats for their Facebook groups and for their messenger group chats. And then also that they're going to have podcast discovery and podcast players inside of the actual Facebook app. So lots of stuff going on. I'm curious what you think that might do to the quality of the shows that are out there. Because I know you have some thoughts on that.
I do. I mean, look, where to start? I mean, if we start with the Facebook thing, that's the one I know probably the least about, but I've seen things like this before. But I will say, as much as I distrust Facebook, I will say that anything that helps podcast discovery is awesome, because the one place that podcasting is truly broken is in discovery, because the only way to find new shows is basically word of mouth. Mm-hmm. And then they say the second largest vector is social media, which is just word of mouth, but online. Yeah. And so I don't even see those as like different. You know, when someone says, "Oh, I heard about it from a friend."
Yeah, it's not like an online thing, like you saw a viral clip of somebody's podcast and decided to go listen to it. It's like my friend asked everybody what your favorite podcasts are, and I went through the comments and found this one that seemed interesting, so I gave it a shot. You know, there's no predictable way of growing.
Right. There's not really. And you can do like ad spends, but they add up so much. I mean, you can spend $1,000 a day and you can be like, okay, that moved the needle, but it's not like making its money back in the first year even of the spend. So then it's like, do you take on investors for a freaking podcast? Not really. So there's a big gap that Facebook could fill for discovery. The problem is now, I don't even know how many people of our generation are still using Facebook. I mean, I'm sure it's millions, but it's also kind of got a rep now as like my parents' social network. So we'll see.
Yeah, I think from the last data that I've been looking at, they're really pushing groups a bunch, and basically finding that the majority of their users are staying active in groups, which for me is true. The majority of my user activity is inside of Facebook groups now, and I think that that'll be an interesting feature that they bring up, because from what I understand, they're like really trying to tackle a lot of problems in the space. So like they'll have podcast discovery, and then you can follow podcasts on the platform, which probably means that you'll be able to do probably some sort of premium subscription tier through Facebook, or some sort of gated content or premium content, you know, behind a paywall or something like that, which makes things really interesting. Because, you know, do you know the latest stats on podcast listeners? Was it like 250 million or something like that? Podcast listeners, 250, 300 million.
I honestly don't know how many listeners there are. I know there are like 2 million podcasts, which doesn't tell us much, because the vast majority of podcasts are like 1 episode, 3 episodes. Those are 2 years old each. They're not active. There's like 250,000 active shows, which means an episode that came out in the last, let's say, 90 days. Right. So maybe close to 300,000. But for Facebook itself, it's going to be, I mean, it fragments the space because they're probably not going to use RSS feeds, but you'll probably put your RSS feed into Facebook and have it chomp on your show and then make it playable in the app. Hopefully.
Yeah. And hopefully they continue to bring in, you know, ability to advertise your show to people that are searching for shows. Because that's the one thing I've always been shocked that Apple's never done. It's like, why wouldn't you have some sort of an advertising model where you could pay to put your show in like a visible spot in Apple Podcasts to get it in front of listeners? You know, like, it doesn't make any sense to me. And it seems like Apple's like almost a little like too little too late coming into the game now that Spotify is making huge moves, and they have been for the past like 3 years. You know, Apple's like, oh, maybe we should do something with that thing we invented like 12 years ago.
Totally.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, the paid subscription thing, as exciting as it is, should have been in the app probably like a decade ago. Yeah, literally. Right. I mean, you could buy iTunes.
How long ago did you start?
2006.
So pre first generation iPhone.
Yeah, pre-iPhone. Yeah, the iPhone came out like a year and change or something later on, or a year after. And I remember when they were like, you can buy music in iTunes for $1, it was like $1 a song.
Yeah,
I'm like,
right.
oh, when did they do this for podcasts so that we can have premium podcasts? And then literally like 10 years later, they're like, hey, let's do this. And I'm thinking, wow. I mean, Patreon is a multi-billion-dollar company that was founded sort of to do this, for not just podcasts, but still. And there's all of these other companies and startups that are doing this that are now kind of screwed. But what the hell? I mean, they could have been taking 30% of $1 per episode for 10 years.
Yeah,
They could have made hundreds of millions of dollars off this by now.
Yeah, and they're losing market share that they don't have to be losing is the weird thing. Like, come on, like you guys literally invented this form of content. It didn't exist. That's why it's called a podcast. Like you invented this form of media, and now other people are beating you at this game. That's just negligence. Like you didn't see opportunity. Like how did you miss this?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is it's such a big company. They saw it as it didn't drive any revenue because they didn't build in the premium thing. So then they assigned 3 people to freaking work there, or like 5 to work in all of podcasting globally, pretty much. Like there's nobody there. It's also from insiders that I know at Apple. I don't know if this is still true, and I don't want to badmouth Apple because I mean they gave us this opportunity as negligent as they were.
Sure.
It's kind of like if you love your mom, but she's like always at work and never does anything for you, and you're like, well, still my mom, right? Like I kind of feel that way about Apple. My mom's great, but the idea here that they missed the boat on this. From insiders at Apple, I know that until recently, and again, it might still be that way, if you worked in podcasting at Apple, you were not going anywhere in the company. It was like you were given that job because you were new. You were given that job because they didn't know what else to do with you. And now I know people that have done things at Apple for years that are offered things like decent sounding positions in podcasting, and I'm like, oh my god, are you going to take it? And they're like, no. This is like everybody at Apple is like, dude, don't take anything in podcasting.
This is where you go to die.
Yeah, it's where you go to die. And I'm trying not to be insulting here, but like, let's look at the people who were sort of the face of podcasting for Apple. Did they move up at Apple? No, they work for like a podcast startup now.
Yeah.
And then they got replaced by somebody else. And that was a guy who loved podcasting, Steve Wilson, nice guy. But like he didn't move up at Apple, and everybody else I know that's had a position in podcasting has either gotten out of it as soon as they could or left the company. That's not a great sign. So
no, it seems like such an oversight. I know it's such a giant company, but they sit on so much cash. It would not have taken much to make, like, if they would have put as much effort into that as Google put into YouTube, because this is around the same time period, right? Like podcasts came out and then YouTube came out and just destroyed any podcast sense of life. Right. Like literally, like YouTube creators became the thing, but podcasts could have easily been something very, very similar to that if Apple would have like done something else with it. But they just didn't. It's so confusing to me, bro.
It is confusing. Like, look, I understand the allure of video, but I don't know what the revenue for YouTube was. It was probably like $13 billion or something last year. I actually have no idea. We should look that up. But the entire industry of podcasting was $1 billion.
Wow.
So what the hell happened there? Right? Like, and that's just the revenue from YouTube. It doesn't mean what all the creators made. The revenue, the industry figures for podcasting include what creators made, because that's the total amount of sales from all the ad networks put together. So there's not really much outside of that. Maybe there's a couple stray $1 million from like all of the Patreon subscriptions for every podcaster added together, or like the merch sales, but there's nothing more than that. So yeah, in a way though, I think I'm lucky that happened that way, because if podcasting had become YouTube, would I be David Dobrik, or would I be the forgotten person who like got there early but never made anything happen? I don't know. Like podcasting,
the Charlie bit my finger type video.
Yeah,
like, Charlie. Remember that?
Yeah, that guy. Oh, David at the dentist. Like, am I that? Because luckily, since podcasting is moving at an absolutely glacial pace, I've been able to build a really nice business off the back of that. But had it moved faster, I might have just gotten eclipsed by like some Gen Z David Dobrik type who's like, nah, man, you got to blow shit up. And I'm like, damn it. Like,
I didn't think about that.
I didn't think about doing science projects in my backyard. Yeah. Like instead I just built slow skills over a long ass period of time, 14 years. And now I'm like, oh, I'm really entrenched. It's hard to knock me out of the position that I'm in. But But yeah, Facebook coming into it, it's going to open up new areas for new players, just like Facebook Watch does. Like every big YouTuber that I know, they also have their stuff on Facebook Watch, and they'll make like 5 or 10 grand a month from Facebook or 20 grand a month from Facebook, but they'll make like 80 grand a month from YouTube. Right. So it's always like a smaller platform that requires separate management and separate everything. And that may happen with podcasting. But I'm more excited about the idea that maybe there will be a way to drive people who are on Facebook, like you said, searching for shows like, hey, plays podcast? Great. Show them an ad for the Jordan Harbinger Show. I'm bidding $3 for new listeners, and I'll get new listeners there all day, every day.
Yep.
Because I tried Facebook ads and then pushing them to like my website to listen to the podcast or pushing them to a podcast app, and I was getting conversion for like $7. I was like, nope, pull the cord on that. Yeah. Not worth it. But if they don't have to leave the platform, and then they've got like Facebook now boasts 20 million podcast plays per day. It's like, okay, now if 30 million people are playing podcasts on Facebook, you just got 5% whatever market share overnight. Now I want to advertise in that app, and that app just happens to be Facebook.
Because that's the thing to me is that people who have been opposed to podcasting in terms of listenership in the past, usually it's because they just don't understand what it is or how to access it, or like they don't understand that there's literally a preloaded app on their phone. You know, like, well, you know, I'll talk to some people like, oh yeah, well, you know, how do I find podcasts? It's like, well, you know, the app on your phone that's called Podcasts, you just open that up. But they again never did any sort of education or teaching around the fact that that everybody has that in the palm of their hand.
Sure.
And so now I think what's going to happen is, you know, I don't know the actual stat. I want to say it's close to like 250, 300 million podcast listeners currently. But when you open that up to a platform that has over 2 billion users on it, that has to increase the total number of podcast listeners over the course of the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, especially if they make it an integral part of their platform. You know what I mean? Which to me presents a really interesting opportunity where that's why I'm encouraging people like, hey, if you've been thinking about it for a couple of years, you probably shouldn't wait too much longer, because I think it's about to become extremely mainstream, and you think it's saturated now, but you know, there's less than 1 million active podcasts. There's 35 million YouTube channels. There's like 500 million blogs. You know what I mean? There's 12 million users on Clubhouse, and it came out a year ago. You know, like Instagram 2 billion, Facebook 2 billion, YouTube. You know, there's just so much saturation on every other platform. So that can't be your excuse. What's next? You know, not enough people listen to podcasts. Well, not anymore, because the number one social media app in the entire world is going to make sure that people can discover podcasts. So now you don't have to open a podcast app or figure out how to use Stitcher or Spotify or find podcasts in those areas. You go to the place where you get all your content anyway, and it happens to be a feature that's in there as well.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. I want to see where it goes. You know, I don't do a lot of videos, so I don't even mess with Facebook Watch or any of that stuff.
Yeah.
But like I said, you know, if it's 20%, 10% of the market for YouTubers, what happens? I mean, if it gets a similar market share for audio, then that's fantastic. That's really, really good. You know, 10% market share in there are apps that have millions of dollars in funding that have like 0.1% market share in podcasting. It's impossible to get. So if you've got an entrenched competitor, or sorry, if you've got an entrenched player in the social media space and they're like, hey, we're doing podcasts, that's great news for the ecosystem. It's going to bring in a lot of junk, but that wave is going to sort of wash over. And then people, especially when they go, oh, why don't we just do what we do, which is your friends also liked. And then it's like, hey, 300 of your friends are listening to the Jordan Harbinger Show. They don't really talk about it, but we see this, you know, in their preferences, and we're showing them this and they're following it there. And if they can add things to the user experience, then great. You know, that whole thing is going to just be so great.